The continual division between doulas and midwives, midwives and doctors, the continual negative press around maternity services does not make women safer. And to increase the disparities and the division between doulas and midwives is not going to improve outcomes by any means. And I'm talking specifically in relation to the sad inquest coroner's outcome of the death of Matilda and the impact that probably hearing the outcome will have had on their parents. Now, I'm not going to focus entirely on this case, but it's prompted quite a few things that come up again and again. There are some units who really discourage and don't like doulas very much. In the same way that they don't necessarily like birthing partners who advocate for their women, their partners, whoever it is that they're with at that point. There are also, in contrast, some doulas that completely slate midwives, completely slate doctors, completely slate obstetric teams. And these extremes and this polarisation means that it's much harder for women, families, birthing people, their partners to navigate maternity services themselves, to be able to obtain adequate evidence-based and information-based care and know who to trust. And we've all got very different perspectives, we've all got very different experiences, and we've all got very different knowledge. And you know what? If we brought everyone together in a team, everyone together in a room, do you know what? The outcomes for most people would probably improve quite significantly. A doula is there to provide that compassionate continuity of care. They have been shown to reduce the chance of caesarean births, improve outcomes, improve psychological well-being, and that's the same with birth partners too. And yes, okay, a doula is almost like a birth educator. They are someone who has some sort of knowledge around sort of the antenatal pregnancy birth continuum process. But actually, you can have just as much as a challenge as a midwife or as a doctor with a birthing partner who has no medical knowledge in the same way that you can with a doula, because they are coming from the perspective of being an advocate for that individual and being an advocate for their wants, their wishes, and what they need ultimately out of labour and birth. And instead, what should be seen is actually they are part of that room, they are part of that process, they are there to help facilitate, support, advocate too in the same way. By seeing something or someone as a barrier, what often happens is people get more defensive or they shut down, and actually they're not working cohesively together at that stage. And so those relationships start to break down, and what that does is that decreases the amount of trust. When you decrease the amount of trust, you are less likely to take on board information that might appear after that. And I think the critical component here is continuity of care. Continuity of care, start to finish, has been shown to improve outcomes for everybody. If you build up a trusting relationship with your midwife or a trusting relationship with your obstetrician, doctor, whoever it is, you are more likely, when someone says something's not quite right here, this is the explanation as to why, and the why is incredibly important. If I am to say to you, you are at risk of something and my guideline says that I need to do this, you're likely to go, do I trust you? Have I ever met you before? Do I know what you've been like as a midwife with me? If I've just met you for the first time, I'm not going to believe you if you just say, well, one piece of paper tells me that I need to do this, so I'm going to do this. Whereas if I explain to you that the reason this has happened, and these are the risks and these are the potential risks, this is why it can happen and this is why it can have a potential outcome, you're more likely to listen and understand, particularly if you have known me before, if you have met me in a previous consultation, a previous appointment. This is where home birth teams are phenomenal, because actually you get to know the team a lot more, which means you build that trust and that rapport that if something happens, you are more likely to listen and take on board that evidence and information, more likely to be given a little bit of space to consider your options. You're more likely to have had that antenatal education ahead of time and those risks provided in the antenatal period too, as a complete holistic package of care, that if it were to come up and happen, then actually it's not quite so much of a surprise, and you're more likely to understand the recommendations why it happens, as opposed to observing somebody as maybe being a barrier. And you know what, as midwives, as doctors, we can learn so much from doulas and the support that they provide to people. Similarly, they could learn from us as well as to why we might be concerned about certain aspects. For example, baby's growth, things like meconium, things like heart rate concerns in labour and birth, for example, and why these might have impacts from a how does a baby adapt, how does a baby cope, and why these things happen. So I know that that's a very long ramble, but do you know what? Cohesiveness, working collaboratively together as a team, including the doulas, the birth partners, and everyone in the conversations, explaining the reasons why, and having that trusting continuity of care before going into labour and birth, makes the biggest of differences. And what we don't need is more division across perinatal services, across pregnancy, childbirth and postnatally. We need more cohesion. And if we all came together collaboratively in the room, what a wonderful team that could happen. What a wonderful improvement of outcomes, reducing medicalisation in the right terms and increasing trust when things aren't quite going so well in the recommendations that's being provided at those times. Division doesn't make people safer. Division widens the gap between good outcomes and bad outcomes, and what we need is better outcomes for everybody. And regulation often means more monetary contribution, which actually decreases the amount of people who can access that support too. As a midwife, I've worked with and I have really loved working with doulas in my time. I understand the concerns that have happened in the past, and I've certainly heard of stories over the years where it has been felt by doctors or midwives where doulas have overstepped their mark in certain situations, particularly when there are high-risk complications, babies who are growth restricted, concerns with heart rates on monitors where there's been delays and things. But I think what we need to start doing is actually bringing people into these spaces and explaining the whys, regardless of is or isn't there. And whilst doulas have been identified in some cases in these things, we've got to ask the reason as to why they're using the doulas in the first place, why we've reached a point where we have got alarm fatigue because medicalisation happens to basically anyone and everyone now, that we are starting to lose sight of what's really a concern and a high risk issue and what's not. And this is where all the lines are being blurred left, right and centre, because we no longer go, this is really high risk and this is why I'm really concerned, because everything has so far become a risk. And the moment you mention the word risk, that's where people either start switching off. If they do become fatigued by it, they're less likely to take on those recommendations. Or alternatively, they are so averse to risk that sometimes they will opt out of the system entirely. And that communication and that working together breaks down. And again, free births have massively increased. And that in itself can have an impact on outcomes too. Trust and continuity of care really helps to improve those outcomes, as well as explaining the reasons why.